He hadn't called that number in over 30 years, didn't even expect it to work. But tonight, something pulled him toward it. Maybe guilt, maybe a remembrance of good times. The line rang, once, twice. Then a voice, young, theme sharp, but controlled. "Who is this?" she asked. He gave his name. She paused, and then said one name. And just like that, his voice cracked. The walls of that luxury office suddenly felt too close, the air too thick, the past louder than ever. He tried to recover, asked about Michael. Her silence hit harder than any scream. Then, with a voice that didn't tremble, she spoke. "He waited. For years. You never came back." No blame, no bitterness, just facts, delivered with a weight that made a grown man grip the edge of his desk like the world had tilted. This wasn't the conversation he expected. And she hadn't even told him the worst part yet. Subscribe now to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ for more gripping real-life tales like this one. And while you're here, tell us in the comments, what country are you watching from? We'd love to know. Because what she says next will break him completely. And this billionaire, he'll never see the world the same way again. He sat in silence, the kind money couldn't fill. Surrounded by glass, steel, and curated art he didn't pick himself. Douglas Wren, the name that made headlines, moved stocks, and once stood for innovation, was now mostly used in apology letters from his PR team. Mid-50s, Ivy League polish, the kind of face you see on magazine covers and donation walls. Once hailed as a philanthropist who understood both worlds, now reduced to boardroom whispers and polite avoidance. The scandal hadn't faded, not completely. One careless phrase during a keynote, caught on a hot mic, had sparked enough noise to fracture his reputation. Something about cultural fit during a hiring discussion. It didn't matter how he tried to explain it after. The impact had already landed. The truth? Douglas hadn't meant harm, but that's what made it worse. It revealed a comfort with power that had quietly grown sharper over time. People noticed, and for the first time in decades, he didn't feel untouchable. He'd considered therapy, rebranding, writing a check to one of the right causes. But none of it sat well. None of it felt like accountability. Just noise. That's when the thought crept in. Michael. He hadn't said that name aloud in years. Michael Daniels. His first real friend. The one who introduced him to jazz, pulled him into community theater, taught him how to defend himself without ever raising a fist. A boy with calloused hands, second-hand shoes, and a mind so bright it threatened to burn through every label placed on him. Douglas was the kid with the encyclopedias and the private tutors. Michael had a mother who worked double shifts and a father who was rarely sober. But somehow it worked. At least for a while. They were inseparable through most of high school until college acceptances came. Douglas got offers, Michael got silence, and slowly the calls thinned. Promises turned into busy signals. Then nothing. Life happened fast for Douglas. Stanford, first startup, IPO, board seats, mansion, book deals, speeches, fame, and Michael? He stopped asking about him. The world didn't have room for both their stories, and Douglas had already picked his chapter. Now, decades later, a casual thought had become a craving. He needed to hear a familiar voice, one untouched by consultants, handlers, or agendas. Was it guilt? Maybe. Or maybe he wanted someone to say he wasn't the man they painted him to be. He found Michael's number buried in an old email chain, still saved, still active. The cursor hovered. It wasn't supposed to mean anything, just a check-in. Nostalgia. Maybe a way to prove to himself he still had ties to something real. He hit call, and that one ring dragged 30 years behind it. He didn't expect what he heard next. Not that voice, not that tone, not the truth waiting just on the other end of the line. The screen blinked, dialing. Douglas leaned back in the leather chair that cost more than Michael's entire apartment once did. He expected a voicemail, maybe a disconnected tone, maybe even Michael himself, older, deeper, maybe surprised to hear his name again. He wasn't prepared for a girl's voice. Hello? Not robotic, not rushed, just present. He blinked. Hi, I was trying to reach Michael Daniels. Is this his number? There was silence, not the hesitant kind, the kind that makes you sit straighter. Then she asked, who's calling? This is Douglas. Douglas Wren. Another pause. Then came a sentence he didn't see coming. You've got a lot of nerve calling this number. His breath caught, not from fear, but from something colder. A kind of mirror he hadn't faced in years. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. You're not sorry, she cut in. Not yet. She wasn't yelling. In fact, her voice was almost too calm, like someone who had rehearsed this conversation just in case the past ever dared to knock. Michael was my father, she said. He passed 5 years ago. Cancer. Worked until the end. You know, just in case the American dream showed up late. The silence on Douglas's end was a vacuum. His mouth opened but offered nothing. He told me about you, she continued. Said you were the kind of friend that felt like family. Said you used to write plays together. Dance like fools on rooftops. Said you promised to stay close when you left for college. She let that hang for a second before driving it home. He waited. Every birthday, every promotion you got, he always said, Doug'll call, he'll remember. But you didn't. He gripped the phone tighter. His million-dollar voice had nothing to say. I don't need an apology, she said, and I'm not here for revenge. But if you called hoping to reconnect or cleanse your conscience, you're 3 decades too late. There was weight in her voice, not bitterness, not anger, just truth, heavy, unmoving, unpolished. Douglas tried to explain. I didn't forget him. I got caught up. Life happened fast. I always meant to. To what, she asked. To send a card? A text? You had the whole world in your pocket, private jets, global reach, and you couldn't pick up the phone? He felt the sting of her words more than any headline had ever managed. He didn't need your money, she said softly. He needed his friend. That did it. His eyes burned. No press briefing had prepared him for this kind of reckoning. Not with protesters. Not with investors. But with a young black woman who had inherited both her father's grace and his disappointment. She didn't slam the phone. She didn't hang up with dramatics. She simply said, you should have been there, and ended the call. Just like that. No closure. No second chances. Only the sound of a line gone dead, and a legacy torn in half. The silence after the call stayed with him longer than the words. It clung to the corners of the room, settled into the folds of his suit, echoed in the space behind his ribs. He leaned back slowly, staring at the ceiling like it held answers. But the only thing up there was memory, and it didn't offer mercy. Michael Daniels. He hadn't said that name out loud in decades, not even in interviews when he was asked about his early inspirations. Never once had he said, I owe a lot to the boy who showed me what rhythm sounds like when you don't have money but still move like the music owns your bones. Douglas could still see it. 2 boys on a cracked sidewalk in South Dallas. Him, awkward in oversized khakis. Michael, smooth without trying. A worn speaker blasting earth, wind and fire from someone's porch. They had danced like they had nothing to lose. And back then, they didn't. Douglas had the house with the air conditioner and a mother who checked his homework. Michael had the apartment where you heard the neighbors sneeze through the walls and a dad who disappeared for days at a time. But they shared everything: comic books, headphones, secrets. In high school, Michael wrote a stage play for their English class. It was brilliant. Raw, funny, full of fire. Their teacher, a white woman with too much perfume and not enough patience, gave it a C. Said it was a little urban for her taste. Douglas remembered how Michael just laughed, then folded the paper twice and said, guess they ain't ready yet. He was always like that, turning wounds into wind, trying to lift everyone. But college changed everything. Douglas got into Stanford on a full ride. Michael applied to 5 schools, never got in, no feedback, no reasons, just silence. They swore to keep in touch. At first they did, calls, letters, late-night chats about their futures. But slowly, Douglas's world expanded. Classes turned into internships. Internships became stock options. Options became buyouts. Michael stayed where he was. When Michael called once in '98, Douglas didn't answer. He was in the middle of a merger. Thought, I'll get back to him next week. That week never came. By the time Douglas had a house in Napa and 3 floors of executive assistants, Michael was just another tab in a dusty mental file cabinet labeled, One Day. But now that tab had been ripped open, and it read like an indictment. She said he waited. Douglas didn't know that. He had no idea that Michael had held on to hope that long, that he'd checked his phone after interviews, watched his old friend on television, and still believed, somewhere deep inside, that Doug would remember. But he hadn't. He didn't even know Michael had a daughter. And yet, she knew everything about him, every accolade, every award, every moment he stood in front of a camera and pretended he built everything alone. The difference was glaring. One had climbed the ladder. The other had held it. And no one applauded that. The words were played in his head on a loop. He didn't need your money. He needed his friend. Douglas had heard hundreds of speeches, sat in rooms where world leaders praised him, but nothing ever hit like that sentence. It wasn't coded in anger. It was delivered like a fact. And facts don't apologize. He found himself scrolling, searching, anything tied to Michael Daniels. A name the world had forgotten, but his conscience refused to. No Wikipedia page, no startup bio, just a sparse obituary in a local Dallas paper. Michael Daniels, 52, beloved father and community artist, passed peacefully. Survived by his daughter, he was a mentor, a dreamer, and a man who gave more than he had. There was no mention of the scripts he wrote, no nod to the nonprofit youth center he ran out of an abandoned rec hall, no line about how he tried, really tried, to build something on streets that ate up hope like pavement cracks. Douglas clicked on an old community video link, grainy footage. Michael in a circle with 6 kids, coaching them through lines from a play he'd written. His smile wide, his voice steady, even when he coughed between breaths. He looked tired, but present. A voice from behind the camera had asked, "Why do you still do this, even with no funding?" Michael had chuckled, "Because somebody once saw me, and until I stop breathing, I'll be that somebody for them." Douglas paused the video. That was the same year he'd raised over $40 million in a single night for a tech accelerator. Same year he bought his second beach property. Same year he didn't return Michael's final email. He pressed play again. Another cough, a sharp wince. The signs were there, but there was no access to premium healthcare. No board of specialists, just a local clinic and prayer. Michael didn't die bitter. That's what stung the most. He died believing in people who didn't believe in him back. He died a black man in America. Brilliant, underfunded, unseen. And even in the end, he never asked for help. He just waited. For a call, for acknowledgement, for a moment that never came. His daughter's words came back like a flood. Cancer took his body, but disappointment took the rest. Douglas thought of all the times he had spoken about equity. All the panels he sat on, the books he endorsed, the tweets he drafted about access and opportunity. Not once had he said Michael's name. Because deep down, saying it meant admitting that he hadn't built everything alone. It meant recognizing that there was once a boy beside him on that cracked sidewalk, matching his steps, sharing his vision, until the world made a decision about whose dreams were worth funding. Douglas stared out the window, city lights stretching far into the distance. Somewhere out there, another Michael was trying to make something from nothing, and another Douglas would step over him without looking back. That thought didn't just shame him. It haunted him. He had once told a journalist that failure was life's best teacher. But what about failing a friend? What about failing someone who loved you without needing you to be rich, polished, or powerful? Douglas didn't just miss a call. He missed a life. The lights in the penthouse flickered off automatically at midnight. But Douglas didn't notice. He sat motionless in the dark, the faint hum of the city outside the only sound in the room. His phone was still in his hand. Screen black, call log open. Her voice still lingering in the air like smoke after a fire. He had delivered countless speeches, TED Talks, commencement addresses, global panels, but he had no words for this. Nothing to defend himself. No polished statement could undo the quiet devastation settling into his chest. It wasn't just grief, it was something deeper. Something that whispered, "You were given the tools to help, and you chose silence." He moved slowly, walking across the cold marble floor to his bookshelf. Not because he needed a book, but because he needed a distraction. But the spine that caught his eye wasn't business-related. It was a dusty photo album, tucked between outdated manuals and gifts he never opened. There it was. The one thing he hadn't touched in years. He flipped through the pages like someone chasing ghosts. There they were. Him and Michael, on the roof of their old high school, laughing, writing stage cues on the back of napkins. A photo of them at a community theater, curtain call, arms raised, and then nothing. The photos stopped around the time Douglas got accepted into Stanford, like life had clipped Michael out of the frame entirely. He pressed his fingers against the image, as if that could summon the warmth of the past, but all he felt was cold paper. A headline flashed across his mind: Douglas Wren pledges $15 million to diversity initiative. He'd been applauded for that, but what was diversity if it didn't start with the people who carried you before the spotlight arrived? He dropped the album and opened his laptop, clicked through his calendar. His week was booked: investor calls, branding meetings, board dinners. All of it felt hollow. Then he opened his email, typed in Michael Daniels. A message popped up, unread. Dated March 14, 2009. Subject line: "Hey man, just thinking about you." Douglas's heart sank. He clicked it open. The words were short. No guilt tripping, no desperate ask. "I caught your interview on PBS. You looked sharp. Crazy proud of you. Life's been weird on my end, but I'm figuring it out. Let's catch up if you're ever back in Dallas. We should talk about the script we started back in the day. I still remember the ending. Hope you're good." Michael. No response had ever been sent. He closed the laptop slowly, let the weight of that unopened message settle on his chest. All these years he thought he'd lost touch because of life's momentum, but the truth was simpler and uglier. He stopped calling, and Michael never stopped hoping. That kind of truth doesn't yell, it just waits, until the silence is too loud to ignore. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. For the first time in decades, the man who'd built empires didn't know what to do next, because apologies don't fix absence, and grief, when laced with guilt, has no finish line. For most of his life, Douglas believed in merit, that success came to those who worked hardest, thought smartest, and pushed longest. That was the story he told on stages and in glossy magazine interviews, the story that made people feel inspired. But now, alone in his penthouse, staring at an unopened email from the man who taught him how to dream out loud, that belief felt like a tailored line stitched into every tailored suit. Michael had worked harder than anyone Douglas had ever known. Smarter, too. He'd faced rejection with a grace Douglas couldn't fake. But grace didn't write checks. It didn't get meetings. It didn't move people who didn't see value in a black man's voice unless it was singing, dribbling, or selling something. Douglas remembered the first investor meeting he ever had. He wore Michael's tie. Could barely afford the gas to get there. A room full of white men nodded politely while he pitched an idea half-baked but well-dressed. He got funded anyway. Michael had pitched youth projects to 3 city councils. He got no's, delays, or silence every time. Too niche, one had said. Too focused on black boys, another wrote. Douglas had called it bureaucracy back then, but now he saw it for what it was. A door wasn't just closed, it was locked, and no one handed Michael the key. This wasn't about one missed call, it was about patterns, about who gets second chances and who doesn't even get a seat, about a system that says dream big, but then crushes those dreams if they don't come with the right accent, pedigree, or skin tone. Michael didn't fail. He was denied. And Douglas, whether he meant to or not, played his part, not by attacking him, but by forgetting him, by letting the system absorb him without interruption. It's easy to name villains when they're loud, harder when they're quiet and familiar, like a best friend who simply stopped showing up. Douglas had stood on stages preaching access and inclusion while stepping over the very person who once held his dreams steady. He thought about all the Michael Daniels that never made it, the ones whose talent wasn't enough, not because they lacked brilliance, but because brilliance without opportunity is just a burden. And the ones who do make it, they're expected to carry entire communities on their backs while being questioned at every turn. How did you get here? Do you belong? Are you the exception? Douglas never had to prove his humanity. Michael had to earn his every day. That's the part no amount of success can erase, the knowledge that for some the bar is on the ground, for others it's dangling above fire. He closed his eyes and let that sit. Not every injustice is violent. Some are quiet, invisible, dressed in manners and meetings. Michael never got loud. He never stormed offices or burned bridges. He just kept trying, until trying wasn't enough, until his body gave out before the system ever gave in. Douglas finally understood. He wasn't haunted by a death. He was haunted by the ease of his own escape. For once, Douglas Wren didn't want to be seen. He wanted to act. He sat alone in his home office, not surrounded by advisors or analysts, but by silence and the question that refused to leave. What now? He couldn't rewrite the years. Couldn't replace the moments Michael spent hoping he'd call. Couldn't take back the birthdays missed or the rejection letters Michael faced without even a word of encouragement from the friend who once promised to always have his back. But he could listen now, not to PR firms or consultants, but to the echo of a voice that never needed to yell to be heard. The first thing he did was search for the youth center Michael had tried to build. The city had closed it down after his passing. Lack of funding, poor structure, no one to take it on. The building still stood, covered in graffiti, windows cracked, forgotten like the man who built it. Douglas bought the property without putting his name on the deed. Renovated it, kept the name. The Daniels Center for Creative Youth. He staffed it with people Michael would have hired. Black educators, community artists, writers who knew what it felt like to be overlooked. No ribbon cutting, just keys handed to the people who'd been locked out too long. Then came the scholarship, quietly announced at a small local high school. The Michael Daniels Fellowship for Black Creators. No GPA requirement, no essay about struggle. Just proof that you had a voice and the world hadn't listened yet. One student cried when she received it. "I thought people like me didn't get picked," she whispered. Douglas didn't speak, just nodded and walked away. It wasn't about saving face. It was about making sure the door Michael stood outside of for years finally opened for someone else. Months passed. He kept a low profile. The headlines faded. The scandal died down, but something stayed different. His office didn't feel like a trophy room anymore. It felt like a museum of unfinished conversations. He began attending a grief support circle. Not the upscale, catered kind, but one run in the basement of a public library. Folding chairs, instant coffee. Real people. He never said Michael's name there, not at first. Just listened. Just learned what regret sounds like when it doesn't come with applause. Then, one afternoon, he sent a letter. Addressed to her, Michael's daughter. It wasn't an apology. It didn't pretend to fix anything. It simply read, "You were right. I didn't show up, but I'm here now. If there's ever anything you need, not from a billionaire, but from a man who failed someone he loved, call this number, or don't. Either way, I'll be listening now." DW. Weeks passed. No reply. Then one evening, his phone lit up. Unknown number. He picked up. Didn't speak first. On the other end, a calm voice said, "We still have the script he wrote. I thought maybe you'd like to help finish it." Douglas exhaled. No redemption, no forgiveness. The Daniels Center opened quietly on a rainy Thursday. No cameras, no sponsors, just a group of kids who'd never been handed permission to dream that loud. Inside, one wall was left bare, white paint, no decoration. The staff said it would be filled by the students. Words, drawings, pieces of what freedom looked like when it wasn't filtered through someone else's expectations. Within a month, the wall was full. Quotes, sketches, a giant mural of a man with open hands and kind eyes. Beneath it, someone had written, "He never made it out, so we could." Douglas stood in that building one evening, long after the kids had gone home. He stared at that mural, hands in his pockets, saying nothing. He didn't need to. He had spent most of his career being seen. But in that moment, what mattered most was seeing others. Later, he'd learned from staff that a few of the scholarship recipients had already started their own writing collective, a group of young Black creatives building something together. One had said, "This is the first place I've walked into and felt like I didn't have to shrink." It wasn't just a center, it was a correction, and people noticed, quietly in the comment sections, in shared emails, in handwritten letters. "I lost a friend like Michael too. We grew up together. Then I made it out and he didn't. I still think about him. This story made me call my father. We haven't spoken in 6 years. He wasn't just your friend. He reminded me of my brother, of my teacher, of my father." For all the press Douglas once paid for, none of it had this kind of reach. This wasn't trending. It was personal. It was truth connecting to truth. Because racism doesn't always arrive with slurs or threats. Sometimes it shows up in who gets remembered and who gets erased, in who gets funded and who gets left waiting, in who gets to recover from a mistake, and who doesn't even get the chance to make one. Michael Daniels didn't live to see his name in lights, but he lit the path for others without needing credit. He gave without being given to. And even in death, he made people feel seen. What Douglas built afterward was not a tribute, it was a mirror. And if you're watching this now, ask yourself, who did you stop calling? Who poured into you before the world knew your name? Who stood beside you when the future was still just a maybe? This story isn't about a billionaire and a man he forgot. It's about what we owe to those who stood beside us before we became someone. And what happens when we remember? Too late. Have you ever lost someone you should have called sooner? Drop it in the comments. We read every word. And if you're still watching, take a moment. Share where in the world you're watching from. Because stories like Michael's, they deserve to be heard everywhere. The truth is, Michael Daniels didn't need fame. He didn't need headlines or honorary degrees. He just needed to matter in the place where it counted most. To the people who knew better, to the friend who once stood beside him under cracked streetlights, writing stories about a world that didn't yet see them. But the world saw Douglas, and Douglas looked away. That's how racism survives. Not just through violence, but through distance, through silence, through polite forgetting. It's in the calls never returned, the invites never sent, the opportunities offered only to those who already fit the mold. And it's in the spaces where brilliance dies quietly, not because it wasn't real, but because it wasn't white enough to survive. Michael wasn't a footnote, he was the main chapter that never got published, and in the end, Douglas couldn't fix that. No building, no check, no scholarship could change the fact that he let his friend carry the weight of being invisible until it crushed him. But he did the one thing left. He listened. Not to the applause, not to the critics, to the truth. And maybe that's the only real redemption there is. Not performance, not publicity, but presence. So if you're still here, watching this, maybe it's time to ask yourself, who have you forgotten? Who helped you before the world believed in you? Because regret is heavy. But silence? That's what buries people. He didn't ask for a spotlight. He asked to not be left in the dark. If this story reached you, if it echoed something you've been carrying, don't just move on. Call someone. Remember someone. Check up on your own people.